It was a cold November night, the kind where the fog clings to the streets like a second skin, wrapping the city of San Francisco in a chilling embrace. The clock on my patrol car's dashboard read 2 o'clock, and the streets were deserted. The usual hum of the city had been swallowed up by the thick fog, leaving behind an eerie stillness that settled like a heavy blanket. Only the distant sound of wind howling through narrow alleys disturbed the quiet, echoing through the empty streets like the whispers of wandering spirits. The air was cold, biting at my skin, and the fog rolled in thick and relentless, turning the city's landscape into a blurry, abstract painting, with faint yellow streetlights cutting through the darkness, casting long shadows. I sat alone in the patrol car. The radio buzzed in the background, crackling with routine updates and mundane reports from other officers on the night shift. The city felt far away from the chaos and life it usually held. Now, it was a shell of itself, suffocated by the fog. The streetlights cast pale yellow patches of light, barely visible through the haze, illuminating the road just enough to show the faint outline of old buildings, each one more weathered and worn than the last. I glanced around, lost in the quiet, wondering what secrets the fog was hiding tonight. My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden shift in the atmosphere, a tingling sensation creeping up my spine. I wasn't sure what triggered it. Maybe it was the way the fog seemed to coil tighter around the buildings, or the way the street ahead appeared to stretch endlessly into the void. But something was off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I slowly drove down a deserted residential street, the kind of street where houses stood like old sentinels, their once pristine facades now weathered by time and neglect. As I passed an old, derelict house on the corner, something caught my attention. Through the dense fog, I could see a shadow of figure standing motionless in the upper floor window. The house seemed to loom over the street, its wooden structure sagging under the weight of years, with peeling paint and broken windows that looked like empty eyes staring out into the fog. The shadow, though faint and indistinct, stood rigid and still. It was unnerving. There was something wrong about it, something I couldn't shake. I stopped the car and sat in silence, staring up at the window, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. For a long moment, everything was still. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in, suffocating, as if the world itself had held its breath. Then, in the dead of night, a shrill scream sliced through the silence, a cry of raw terror that echoed through the streets and froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't an animal's scream or a passing car alarm. It was unmistakably human, a cry filled with panic and desperation, an unmistakable sound of someone in immediate danger. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed the radio and pressed the button to report the disturbance, my voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline coursing through me. "This is Officer Zafar, requesting backup. Possible disturbance at address, over." My voice sounded calm, but my body was already moving. The scream had come from inside that house, and there was no time to waste. I grabbed my flashlight, got out of the car, and made my way toward the cracked walkway leading up to the front door. The house seemed to watch me as I approached, its windows dark and hollow, like eyes that followed every movement. The front door, warped by years of neglect, creaked open under my hand as if it had been waiting for someone to enter. The air inside was stale, filled with the heavy scent of old wood, mold, and a strange metallic tang that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The stench was sickly, overpowering, and something about it felt wrong, like blood that had long since dried, leaving behind a ghostly memory of violence. Inside, the house was dark and empty, save for the shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe across the walls. My flashlight beam revealed broken furniture, torn wallpaper, and dust thick enough to blanket everything like a forgotten shroud. The house had been abandoned for years, left to rot and decay, but there was something else, an unnatural stillness. a weight that hung in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Every step I took echoed in the silence, each creak of the wooden floor sounding louder than the last. I made my way cautiously through the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest, every muscle tense, ready for whatever I might find. As I moved toward the staircase, the air grew colder, heavier, and I could feel an almost tangible sense of dread pressing in on me. The stairs groaned beneath my weight, the wood splintering slightly with each step. As I ascended to the second floor, I could hear the sound of my own breathing, shallow and quick, filling the otherwise oppressive silence. At the top of the stairs, I hesitated. The hallway stretched before me, dark and narrow, its shadows clinging to the walls like they were alive. And at the far end, just past the corner, I saw it, the door to the room where I had seen the shadow. It was slightly ajar, as though waiting for me. My pulse quickened, and I stepped forward, pushing the door open with a creak that sounded like a whisper. The room was bathed in darkness, and my flashlight illuminated something that made my blood run cold. A woman sat in the far corner of the room, bound to a chair with thick ropes. Her wrists and ankles were tightly bound, her clothes torn and ragged, her face pale as a ghost. Her eyes, wide with terror, locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew that whatever had happened here, it was far from over. I stepped forward slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. Her eyes pleaded with me, her gaze desperate, as if she could see the fear I felt and was begging me to act. Her voice, muffled by a cloth tied tightly over her mouth, came out in a whisper, shaky, broken. He took me," she gasped, her words barely audible. I ignored him. At the university, and he couldn't handle it. Her story tumbled out in fragments, piecing together a chilling tale. She explained how she had known the man from her university days, an obsessive acquaintance who had stalked her for months, learning her routine, watching her from the shadows. She had thought that time would erase him, but it hadn't. The man had returned, lurking outside her apartment, and finally, he had struck. He had taken her, brought her to this forgotten house, and imprisoned her in this very room, believing no one would ever find her. Her words were broken, but the terror in her eyes was undeniable. I could see the depth of the fear that still gripped her, even as I carefully untied the cloth from her mouth, giving her a chance to breathe. I grabbed my radio and called for backup, my voice sharp with urgency. Backup needed immediately. "We have a hostage situation here." The room felt suffocating, the air thick with fear, and I could hear her breathing, quick and shallow, as she kept glancing nervously toward the door. She was waiting for him to return. I tried to reassure her, but nothing I said could quell the panic that held her in its grip. Soon, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance. Backup had arrived. Officers flooded into the house, their footsteps echoing throughout the empty space as they moved with precision, spreading out to secure the perimeter. It wasn't long before they escorted the woman out of the house, her eyes constantly darting over her shoulder, as if the darkness itself might reach for her again. She was free, but her fear was far from over. It didn't take long to find him. We discovered the man hiding in the basement, crouched in the shadows, listening, waiting. He didn't resist as we approached, his eyes vacant. Yet there was something twisted in the cold smile that tugged at the corners of his lips. As the officers handcuffed him and led him away, his gaze met mine. For a moment, I thought I saw some flicker of victory in his eyes, a recognition of some twisted accomplishment in his mind. Once the scene was secured, I was left alone in the house to complete the final inspection. The silence returned, but it felt heavier now, as if the house had absorbed all the fear, the hatred, and the pain that had been inflicted within its walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that this house, this forsaken place, wasn't done with its story. It would wait, biding its time, until another tale of terror would unfold within its decaying walls. As I stepped out into the night, the fog seemed to envelop me, swallowing me whole. The city remained silent, a place of secrets, hidden behind layers of mist, and I couldn't help but wonder how many other dark stories were waiting to be uncovered in the city's shadowed corners, each one more chilling than the last. We cautiously advanced down the narrow hallway, the walls seeming to close in with every step. The air was thick, the oppressive silence broken only by our footsteps echoing in the confined space. At the end of the hall, a door stood partially open, casting an unsettling shadow on the floor. And there she was. She stood in the doorway, motionless, her eyes sharp as blades, staring at us with a fixed, cold gaze hard as stone. Her expression was so still, so devoid of any emotion, it made the hair on the back of my neck rise. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched by something far beyond a human presence. Jason, the leading deputy, shouted commands, demanding that she come out. He tried to be calm, his voice authoritative, but the woman didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She stood there like a statue, impervious to fear, to reason. It was as if she were beyond the reach of persuasion, beyond the understanding of any of us in that moment. "Come out with your hands where we can see them," Jason barked again, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure. But still, she didn't move. Jason, growing more desperate by the second, fired warning shots into the wall beside her. The sound of the gunshots ricocheted through the narrow corridor, the bullets slicing through the plaster with an almost mocking precision. Yet, even that failed to stir her. She remained still, her gaze unwavering. It was as if she were daring us to make the first move. Suddenly, as if she had been waiting for this cue, her body sprang into action. The speed was almost inhuman. In a flash, she lunged forward, a gleaming knife gripped tightly in her hand. Her face twisted with an undeniable determination, an expression that spoke of something far darker than any of us could have anticipated. It was no longer a confrontation. It was an execution. I instinctively retreated, my heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline surging through me. The hallway was cramped. Every step I took only a step closer to the end. My mind raced to process what was happening, but the reality was far too fast, too brutal. I stumbled slightly, trying to put space between myself and the deadly blade, but there was nowhere to go. Jason fired again, but the shots went astray in the chaotic narrowness, missing her by inches. I watched in horror as the knife swung toward my chest. The realization of pain hit too late. It felt like the world stopped for a moment, the air thickening around me as the cold steel of the blade sank into my flesh. The agony erupted inside me, fierce and all-consuming, like a comet tearing through my body. A jagged pain shot through my chest, the world tilting around me. It was impossible to breathe. The woman pulled back, and I staggered, trying to maintain my balance as my legs weakened beneath me. My vision blurred, but before I could even register what had happened, another officer fired. This time, the bullets found their mark. The woman crumpled to the floor, the knife slipping from her grip, her lifeless form collapsing into the shadows of the hallway. The shouting ceased. A thick, haunting silence descended on the scene, hanging like a dark cloud over everything. It felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in, sealing us in this macabre moment. My breath came out in ragged gasps, each one more painful than the last. The agony was overwhelming, like flames licking at my insides, but my mind struggled to focus. I tried to call out, but my voice was no more than a faint whisper at first. No one noticed I was hurt, not in the chaos. I was a ghost amid the frenzy of officers rushing to secure the scene. But when they finally realized, the response was swift. They lifted me gently, guiding me toward the ambulance. The blaring sirens accompanying me to the hospital felt surreal, as if they were carrying me away from something I couldn't quite escape. Inside the hospital, the doctors worked with an urgency that only came with life or death situations. They told me the wound wasn't fatal, that I'd be okay in the end, but the pain was beyond anything I had ever experienced. It was a strange moment of clarity, realizing how close I had come to death, how fragile life truly was. Later, I learned more about the woman. Her name was Yan Li, 47 years old. She had been struggling with eviction threats for a long time, a woman caught in a web of hopelessness, clinging to her home despite repeated warnings. Her desperation had driven her to this final, tragic confrontation where she chose to fight rather than give up. She had been a victim in her own way, but it was too late for any of that now. It was late October, the season when the night falls faster, the air colder, and the winds whispers through the trees with a strange energy. I remember that night so clearly, how silence settled over the small town in Texas, a weight in the air that was heavier than usual. It was the kind of quiet that creeps in during the early hours of the morning, when the world feels empty, and spirits seem to hide in the shadows of deserted streets. As I drove my patrol car through the empty roads, everything felt wrapped in a blanket of eerie emptiness. The faint whisper of tires on cold asphalt was the only sound that broke the silence. Our town was always sleepy after midnight, with little happening. The occasional bar fight, or maybe a stray animal searching for food. But tonight was different. At 2:15 a.m., the radio crackled suddenly, slicing through the stillness like a sharp flash. I grabbed the device, hearing the desperate voice of a man. "Officer, please. I think there's someone in my house." His voice trembled, fear fully taking control of him. My heart skipped a beat. There was an urgency, a raw panic in his tone that unsettled me. I replied, trying to calm him down. "Take a deep breath, sir. What exactly did you see?" But instead of an answer, there was only silence. In those few moments, I could hear his breathing fast, ragged, as if he was trying to keep his terror in check. Then abruptly, the call was cut off. I tried to call him back, but it went straight to voicemail. The hairs on my neck stood up. I checked the caller ID, confirmed the address. It was only a few streets away, at the edge of town, an area rarely visited at that hour. There was something strange in his voice, something that made my skin crawl. I decided to check it out for myself. When I arrived, I parked my patrol car by the roadside, expecting to see a house lights on, maybe someone outside. But what I saw was baffling. There was no house, only vast fields stretching endlessly, melting into the darkness of the night. In the distance, the shadows of trees swayed under the pale moonlight, and the faint murmur of the wind passed through the leaves like a secret whisper. A lone farmhouse stood far off, with a flickering, dim porch light. It struggled against the shadows, the light a weak defiance against the darkness. I checked the address again, my eyes fixed on the paper in my hand. It was correct. But where was the house? How could there be an address without a real structure? A strange feeling crept into my mind, as if the darkness itself was watching me, whispering secrets I wasn't ready to understand. My feet moved toward the farmhouse, each step echoing louder than the last in the vast silence. I knocked on the door, my knuckles striking the old wood. After a moment, the door creaked open, and a young man stood before me, his eyes half closed with exhaustion. He stared at me, confused. "Can I help you, officer?" I hesitated. "I received a call from this address, or somewhere close by." The caller seemed to be in danger, but I couldn't find any other houses nearby. "Do you know if anyone else lives around here?" He frowned and slowly shook his head. "No, officer. There's no one else for miles. We're alone out here." He paused for a moment, then looked at me with concern. "Are you sure you're at the right place?" My confusion deepened, but frustration also began to bubble up. Yes, I'm sure. Thanks anyway. I walked back to my car, feeling a strange unease pressing in around me. As I started to drive away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there, sitting in the back seat, was a shadowy figure. Its eyes gleamed ominously in the darkness. A cold shock ran through my veins. I reached for the radio, ready to call for help. But before I could speak, I felt a sharp blow to the back of my head. The pain exploded behind my eyes, and then nothing. I woke up in a hospital, the bright lights stinging my eyes. My head throbbed painfully, every heartbeat pounding against my forehead. I tried to sit up, but a nurse gently pressed me back down. Take it easy, officer. It's been a rough night. I looked around, trying to grasp what had happened, but everything was a fog. I remembered the call, the empty field, and the person in my car. Was it all a dream? But the pain in my head told me it was real. One of the officers came in, his face a mixture of relief and worry. We found you unconscious in your patrol car near that old farmhouse. There was no one else, just you, slumped over the wheel. I whispered, barely able to make a sound. What about the person in the back seat? Did you see them? They exchanged uneasy glances, and one officer spoke. No, there was no one else. We searched the entire area. We even asked the farm residents, but they hadn't seen anyone strange. I leaned back, a cold chill running through my veins. I had seen him. I knew I had, but they didn't believe me. And deep down, I wasn't sure of myself anymore. Later, I searched for the address. There was no records of any house in that area, only abandoned land, forgotten by time. I returned to that place several times, chasing ghosts from my memory, but each time, the field remained silent, the road empty, as if the night had swallowed all its secrets.